finally we gave up, right? It was like, well, we have to move on to the next site. We didn't find this snake. And on our way back, we're hiking, and we get back to the front of the park where there are little cabins that you can stay in. I think there was maybe a shower, I don't remember. But it just seemed like, oh, this is gonna be so nice. And some people went to the cabins, but myself and some of the other herpetologists on this trip, there was a path that had just been cut through the park, through the singy, where you actually now could walk because it had been made flat. And so the singy's all around you, but you're walking on a flattened path. And so nobody had ever done any herpetology work there because that was very new. And we're walking along, and all of a sudden on the path there's this snake, and it's in a genus that is one of the most common snakes you see. It's called Madagascar. But this snake was different looking than this typical one you see. It was very attenuate in its body shape. It was a really light gray, pale color, and it just had kind of a different look about it. And we grabbed it, we bagged it, and we brought it back to camp. And it turned out to be a brand new species of snake. So that was really exciting, and it shows, you could have all this terrible luck.
My guest today is Dr. Sarah Ruane. Thank you for joining me, Sarah.
My pleasure.
Sarah is Associate Curator of Herpetology here, as well as Director of the Core Laboratories at the Field Museum of Natural History, and also a Graduate Advisor at the University of Chicago.
Yep.
Great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's start with, why do you think people have such a fear of snakes? Do you think it has an evolutionary origin?
So that's a really interesting question because there has been research on whether people are innately afraid of snakes, which would imply that evolutionary origin, or is it a cultural learned experience that you get from your community, from your parents, from those around you who are afraid of snakes, and so it's easy for you to be afraid too. And I would say the jury's out on which it is because there has been evidence for both of these hypotheses. It could be both, they could be working in tandem. Certainly there are snakes out there that can eat people, which is really the biggest reason to be afraid of them. There's very few, but there are 2 or 3 around the world, and maybe 2 in particular that I think have some eating people on their records. So reticulated pythons in Southeast Asia, certainly there's records of them having been able to swallow people. Typically when snakes eat people though, it's children or small women, because although a python can kill, a big python, a 20-foot python can kill an adult man if it was able to get a hold and wrap around, right? You breathe out, the snake squeezes tighter. Swallowing an adult man for most snakes is very, very difficult because men typically have much broader shoulders than women. So women are most susceptible. That being said, this hardly ever does happen. African rock pythons also are a snake that has, I think, some eating people on their tally. And so it's not crazy for people to be afraid of snakes. And if you think about it from the evolutionary perspective, you go back tens of thousands of years or a couple million years or further back, and maybe we're not talking about Homo sapiens, but we're talking about other hominins. There were other snakes that were even bigger back if you go further back in the fossil record. And so being afraid of a snake is similar to being afraid of another predator potentially. But you don't hear about people being afraid of bears, which you should be maybe more afraid of, or mountain lions. I mean, people are afraid if one actually comes at them, but they're not thinking about it the same way where a photo of one will scare somebody.
Yeah. But so you think that people are more fearful of being the food of the snake versus the neurotoxin that would kill you?
So when I think about it from the evolutionary standpoint, it's really from the idea of this thing is a predator and you should be worried about it because it might eat you, because that seems like a bigger concern to me. But there's of course this aspect of there's a lot of snakes that are venomous. It's not most snakes, but it's not an insignificant number. Being worried about that is pretty overblown in many parts of the world. I'm going to talk about the United States because that's where we are. In the US, being afraid of a snake being venomous and that being the reason in your mind, most of the snakes you see aren't venomous. And the ones that are, they're not going to do anything. So none of these snakes are going to do anything unless you try to pick them up. You accidentally step on one. You think you're going to kill one with an axe or a hoe or whatever you have on hand, and somehow in doing that you get bit. Right? This animal's just defending itself. And so whether or not people come from this evolutionary standpoint because they are worried about, or it's been ingrained in them in some innate way to be worried about being envenomated. That's also potentially true, but that's such a human-caused interaction for the most part. It's not the snake coming to people to bite them. And again, I would be more worried. People don't have that kind of reaction to animals that are far more dangerous. People should be more worried about getting attacked by a stray dog, than they should be about some random venomous snake showing up on their doorstep just to bite them. It's pretty much never going to happen. So I think personally that there's more of a cultural aspect to this fear of snakes, that it's perpetuated, and that it might be innate, but I don't think it is necessarily due to worried about being eaten, worried about being venomous, but just snakes are weird. The thing I like about them so much is I think the thing that makes people feel uncomfortable, which is they don't have any legs, and they move in this very gliding, quiet, for people who don't like snakes, almost a sneaky seeming way, like they could sneak right up on you and slither on in. And I think that's what kind of gets up in people's heads and makes them feel afraid in a way that's pretty unnecessary for the actual threat snakes pose to people. And again, in the United States, it's really low. I had an undergraduate that I worked with. I was a professor at Rutgers University before I came to the Field Museum. And I had an undergraduate summer student who did a project that part of it was comparing accidental deaths in the United States to snake bites and snake bite deaths. And snake bites from venomous snakes, that's a moderately high number, in the hundreds per year, if not sometimes the thousands, depending. But
in the US,
yeah. But deaths from that are not on a yearly basis even. That's very rare. Whereas people die from things like bees, in comparison, much more frequently. But most people are not quite, they don't see a picture of a bee or a wasp and have to look away. I've had students, when I've taught classes, every now and then tell me, I can't come to the lecture. I'll tell them the next lecture is going to be a little bit about my own research program, and we're going to use some of the concepts we taught in class when I've taught evolutionary biology, and I'll show you how I apply some of what we've talked about in my own research. And I've had students say, I can't come to the lecture because I can't look at photos of snakes.
Right.
Which, I'm very sympathetic. I don't want to ever make somebody feel bad about their phobias. So I get it. It's fine. It won't be on the test.
To your point, people should be fearful of mosquitoes.
They should be, right? Mosquitoes amongst animals, they kill more people than anyone else by transmitting diseases.
Yeah.
Or you should be afraid of, people are sometimes afraid of rodents and mice in their house. I was going to say because they're bringing in ticks that have Lyme disease, or they're bringing in fleas that have bubonic plague. There's all these things that are much, 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 much worse. So I always try to tell people, snakes in the US, your chances of getting bit are very low, and it really only happens when you force that interaction on the snake. In other parts of the world where outdoor agriculture combined with a great climate where snakes are active year-round and there are a lot of venomous snakes present, that's a different story, because people are sometimes out working in agricultural fields. They may or may not have any shoes on, they might be wearing shorts. These agricultural fields, let's say it's rice, the grains are attracting rodents, and the snakes are like, this is a great place to be, right?
Yeah.
And people step on them. And so that's, nobody's fault, right? People are trying to do their job. The snake is just trying to sit there and hope something comes along they can eat. They're never biting the person because they're trying to eat them. They're being stepped on and they feel as though they're being attacked.
Yeah.
And in places where that happens, countries such as India, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central America, if you were to get bit by a venomous snake, so something like a Russell's viper in India, you're going to try and get to the hospital potentially, and they may or may not have anything to treat you with, because the shortage of anti-venom in some parts of the world is ridiculous, how little is available. So people may try and get treated. A lot of people do die from snake bites in other parts of the world because the treatment would work, but it's just not even available.
Yeah. Well, it's also, even if you have the treatment, getting there quick enough,
just getting
right?
there quick enough, because you might be very far away from a hospital that has it. You may try to not go immediately because you think it's not going to be that bad. You may try some sort of homeopathic antidote. Like, that's not the right word. But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So when things like that happen, the longer you wait, the worse it's probably going to be without getting proper treatment. And it doesn't mean you're going to die, but when you look at photos of people who have been bit by snakes where it's gone untreated, or even when it's been treated, but it's been hours or even days later, it's pretty rough looking. It's a lot of necrosis. It's like, if it's your hand, you're probably going to lose some fingers. If it's your calf, you're going to miss a big piece of flesh, the big muscle in the back of your calf. That's going to be potentially all digested out by the enzymes in the snake venom. So it's definitely a much bigger problem in other parts of the world. So the caveat to me saying people get overworked or worked up about this, I'm really talking about people in the United States in that circumstance.
Yeah. Well, have you had any close calls yourself with a snake?
So I have never been bit by a venomous snake. People ask me all the time, do you ever get bit? And I say, I get bit all the time by snakes. I don't get bit by venomous snakes, or I haven't been bit by a venomous snake so far. You know, this isn't wood, but knock on it, yet. And I'm hopefully that never happens. I handle venomous snakes very carefully, and so does everyone I know that I work with. That being said, I've known a couple people who have been bit by venomous snakes. One while I was with them in the field in Panama, and I can say that having seen that happen, and he was fine.
Was it a Bothrops?
It was a Bothriechis, so the little arboreal Bothrops. So close relative, not quite as toxic. They don't get quite as big. This one was very little, and it was just one fang got him in the side of his finger, and I mean, I don't know if he's going to watch this or not, but he didn't learn any lessons from it, is what I will tell you. Because one, he got a tattoo of the fang of that species on his middle finger, and I've seen plenty of pictures of him still picking up venomous snakes. So I don't think he learned anything. I mean, maybe he's more careful, I hope.
He likes to live on the edge.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. But that sort of cured me from being, I would never say that I've ever been reckless, but I don't ever pick up venomous snakes unless I'm working on a project that is about that species. I don't do it just, normally when I see any snake, I grab it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't do that just to pick up a venomous snake, though. I'd be, well, if we're not doing a project, we don't need it for something, I'm not going to do anything with it. I mean, I might position it with a snake hook or something so I can take some nice photos.
Yeah.
Right? But I'm not going to do anything super reckless for no reason. But that being said, people do ask me, do you get bit by snakes? And so when you get bit by a non-venomous snake, this is another thing I always tell people who are a little bit worried, and I hope this, I don't know if it makes them feel better or not, but I always tell people, when you think about a snake, and you think about what it does in its daily life when it eats, snakes open up their mouths really big vertically. And they also open up their mouths, at least on the lower jaw. Ours is fused, but similar to where the upper and lower jaw and the snake attach, it's not in a socket, it's just a stretchy ligament there. And right here, it's also just a stretchy ligament. So the snake's jaw on the bottom jaw also goes out horizontally. So their mouths get huge when they eat something big. They do not chew. The amount of musculature in a snake's mouth that exerts any bite force or pressure when they bite is so minimal that it feels like a really big snake will feel like something. But a snake that's 6 or 8 feet long, you might give a little shriek because it's a surprise an animal is biting you, but it's just like little pinpricks. It doesn't feel like this pressure. This morning, 2 of my dogs got into a minor skirmish, and my dogs, so it was like an 11-pound dog versus an 8-pound dog. My dogs are little. And in unskirmishing them, one of them, they're trying to like bite at each other, and one of them bit my hand, and he didn't break my skin or anything. Even now, just doing that, the pressure from this 8-pound dog's jaw was shocking.
Yeah.
Like, I'd rather get bit by a snake any day and have the skin broken by these tiny little teeth than this itty bitty dog who's, thinks he's real tough biting with, a slightly bigger dog. It was unbelievable how much pressure just without breaking my skin even that the dog has. And so I always tell people, getting bit by a mouse or a dog or a human, that would hurt. Getting bit by a snake, it doesn't feel like anything. It's more of a surprise.
Yeah, but watch out for the poodles.
Yes, you gotta watch out. The toy poodles, they'll get you.
I read that on your website.
Yeah, I love poodles.
How many poodles do you have?
I have 3.
Oh, wow.
I have 3. I have a miniature poodle and 2 toy poodles, and I compete with them in agility.
So the miniature, I assume, is smaller than the
He's
toy?
bigger. No, the toys are the littlest.
Oh, the toys are the
Yeah,
smallest.
the toys are the smallest, and then the
Interesting.
miniature is the sort of medium-sized, and then standard poodles are the big ones.
So you compete with just one of the 3?
I've competed in different dog sports with all 3 over the years. The oldest one is 12 or 13. He is totally deaf, and
He's retired.
He's retired. He's totally
Okay.
retired.
Yeah.
He's still happy to get into a fight with the other ones, right? All 3 of them are 3 boys, and I'd say they're all like, none of them have ever backed down from a brawl. But they're very sweet dogs, but they're dogs, and sometimes, there's a little piece of food on the floor, and that is, that's a hot commodity worth fighting for.
But the other 2 are still
The
competing.
other 2 are still competing, and I
Yeah.
compete with them primarily in agility. So this is, running, and they're going over obstacles, and I'm screaming at them to do stuff. And so that's my big hobby outside of work.
How often do you have to train them?
So I go to a weekly class, and when they're young and they're learning everything and they don't know anything, to me, that's actually the most fun part. Is I love the training. I find it so rewarding and so gratifying. By the time they're about 2 years old, you're still teaching them, because you can make this very complicated, right? You can make this sport be something where you're like, it's like you're training for the Olympics with the dog. But by the time they're 4 or 5, they're probably sort of like set it and forget it. So I still do go to class with these 2 younger ones once a week. And I also have a full agility course at my house, so I can train every day if I want. I actually, when I flew out to look at houses from New Jersey, the number 1 requirement I had was enough space that was flat so that I could buy some of the bigger obstacles that I didn't have space for in New Jersey. So I go through phases where I'm training every day.
So you have that tunnel and the
yeah,
ramp and the
I've
whole
got
thing?
multiple tunnels, the big A-frame, the big ramp,
Yeah.
the dog walk, which is like a catwalk ramp,
Wow.
weave poles, probably 20 jumps. Yeah, I've got all that stuff. My house, the front of my house looks like, I don't know.
Did you grow up with poodles? Is that
No,
why?
I actually grew up with German Shepherds.
Oh.
And I love German Shepherds too. I like dogs in general.
Yeah.
But when I was an undergraduate and I finished my undergrad, I applied to some internships to do some sort of, I thought I might want to go to grad school, but I wasn't positive. And I thought I need to do something that gets me into the realm of like what that might be like. So I applied to a bunch of projects that were, I don't know if they were all snake-based, but the one I really wanted was radio tracking rat snakes and corn snakes in northern Florida, just outside of Tallahassee, and that is the internship I got. And so I packed up my Volvo, my 1990 Volvo. This was in 2004, and this car was early night, like this 1992 Volvo, and drove down there. And after I'd been there for a couple of weeks, I was there for about 6 months. It was like a 6-month stint. And maybe 1 month, and everybody, you lived on the property. It's called Tall Timbers Research Station, and their main focus of research has a lot to do with bobwhite quail. And a lot of the people who work there are given the option to live on the property. It's a super big piece of property. And so I was living there, and everybody had a dog, and I wanted a dog so much. And we had German Shepherds all my growing up. I love German Shepherds, but I did not want a dog that big. And also my mom's husband is allergic to dogs, sort of, right? Not super every dog, but something like a real furry big dog. If I ever needed to leave the dog with my mom to watch it, which I knew I would at some point, I thought, I need to get something that is more in the realm of no shedding, low dander, less likely to trigger allergies. And I thought, poodles. And I saw an ad in the Tallahassee Times or the Tallahassee Tribune or whatever it's called. And it was like and I didn't want a puppy. And I'd gone to the animal shelter a couple times and looked at dogs and I actually tried to get some some very decrepit old dog that I felt bad for, and somebody else adopted it. So I'm happy for that dog. And there's a 2-year-old toy poodle in the newspaper, and I called them up like I was having a panic attack, like somebody was going to get this dog before me.
Yeah.
And I drove to their house, and I gave them $180 in cash, and they said, oh, we're retiring, and we're going to be traveling. We don't have time for this dog. And this dog barked at me like a machine gun, like it did not want to go with me. And I said, I'll take him. I loaded this dog up in the car and drove off with him. And he was such a great little dog. His name was Merlot, and he's the first dog I got as an adult lady. And he really made me kind of only want poodles moving forward. Although sometimes I think about other breeds of dog. So he lived a nice long life, and then when he passed away, rescued a miniature poodle from a place that brings dogs from other parts of the country. And then I had him for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years. And I thought, this dog is great, but I kind of want another one to do more sports with. I had been doing obedience with him, and I kind of wanted to try some other stuff. Got another poodle puppy, trained with him for about 2 years. He has a little bit of environmental sensitivity where when you're in big competition arenas, sometimes he just can't, right? Mm-hmm. He can't even. Although he's very talented. He's actually the most talented, but he's also the least able to perform under pressure. So then I was like, all right, I gotta get a dog that can just do all the stuff all the time. And so my youngest dog, his name is Riot. He is a real all-rounder. He does all the stuff. He doesn't act too much like a fool. He doesn't embarrass me too much. Nothing will humble you the way a dog doing a competition is able to.
Yeah.
So the dogs are my big thing outside of snakes.
Yeah. So are you from Jersey?
No, I'm very originally from northeastern Pennsylvania, so just outside of Scranton. And so I started my growing up there. And then when I was in 7th grade, my mom got a job in New York City, and so I lived in New York City through the rest of middle school and all of high school. And then my mom still lives in New York. I did my PhD in New York, and then I did a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History, which is also in New York. And so I spent a really long chunk of my time in New York as well.
And then you went to Rutgers.
And then I did 10 months down in Louisiana.
Oh.
I did a second postdoc, and I got the Rutgers job. I actually interviewed for it the first month I was down in Louisiana, and so my Louisiana stint was short, but it was very productive. And it caused a really nice collaboration with the herpetology curator at the museum there. And so he and I actually just went to Papua New Guinea in February and March for a grant that we wrote together.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And then I went to Rutgers.
How was Papua New Guinea?
It was pretty awesome.
Yeah.
I had a really, really good time. I wrote this grant with my collaborator back in, we submitted it multiple times because that's how getting a grant goes, right? You just keep rolling the dice, swinging the bat. We finally got this grant funded. I got notified in spring of 2019, and the grant went into effect, or theoretically went into effect, February of 2020. And so we did not go to New Guinea for a very long time, right? There was no going to Papua New Guinea until, let's see, it's 2025. It took us 5 years, but COVID, and then somebody got kidnapped in New Guinea, a researcher, and so there was visa stuff where they weren't necessarily being very forthcoming with visas for researchers. And then just logistically, some different things happened. But we went in February and March, and it was great. I got to see, everything I got to see while I was there is a genus of reptile or amphibian that I've never seen in life.
Wow.
So that was very exciting.
Did you make any new discoveries when you were there?
So on this trip, I'm not sure if any, to be very honest, I'm a herpetologist, but I really don't study frogs. Yeah. Right? So we caught a whole bunch of frogs, maybe some of them. Yeah. I'll catch everything, but somebody else needs to sort out the frog stuff. It's not going to be me. So I can't tell you anything about whether the frogs might be of importance, but they might be.
But no new snakes.
No new snakes on this trip. So this was a lot of collecting a lot of species that are already established or known in science. But one of the really cool things about doing projects in places like New Guinea or in Madagascar, which is the other place I do a lot of my research now, is that you don't necessarily know from just collecting the animal and looking at it that there's something special about it until way, way down the road. So the person I've been working with who's been focused on New Guinea for the last 20 or 30 years at this point, I was like, I gotta think back. I think he started going there in the late 80s or early 90s.
Yeah.
Must have been the 90s. He has a massive collection of snakes he's collected, and he doesn't really focus on snakes on his own time. And so when I was at Louisiana State University at the museum there, this was an opportunity for him to sort of like dust off the snakes and say, hey, I don't know, there might be something here worth looking at or investigating.
Right.
Some other students in the past had looked at some molecular data from a group of snakes that are called ground snakes, which I guess is not the most exciting name.
Yeah.
But these ground snakes, and it looked like there were probably undescribed species based on how genetically distant snakes were in this group. And so because of that, we started working on that in a much more, I'll say, vigorous and rigorous molecular approach, where you're not just sequencing one gene or 3 genes, but you're sequencing thousands of genes at once. And from that, from both the initial work with just a couple of genes, combined with looking at specimens of the animals that had been collected that match up with those the tissues that you're using, we described 4 new species of snakes from Papua New Guinea, as well as the Indonesian side of New Guinea in 2018. I think it was 2018, it might have been 2017. We'll say 2018. And we're still working on that, and I can tell you that there are going to be additional species from that group, but it's not that we just caught them on this trip, it's already sort of in the works, sort of in process. And also some other really exciting, well, it says an oxymoron, some really exciting taxonomy changes, right? Like nobody's going to be like, wow, yeah, that's it. I can't stay tuned. But it's exciting to me.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the role that snakes play in ecosystems?
Yeah, so people who don't like snakes think things like the only good snake is a dead snake, right? People say stuff like that all the time. People say stuff like that to me all the time, even though they know that I actually really love snakes. And I always want to tell people, and any opportunity I get to, you might think snakes aren't doing anything important, but the reality is they are often top predators in the ecosystem they're in. Unlike most lizards, and I will point out snakes, and we can talk about this more too if you want, but snakes are just a kind of lizard. They're not something totally separate from lizards. It's not like here's all the lizards and then here's snakes. It's here's lizards and snakes are in there with them, right? They're just the most successful group of legless lizards that are around today. So one thing, people don't usually have it in for lizards, right? Lizards seem, which is why I think the leglessness thing is what freaks people out. Lizards mostly eat invertebrates, and there are lots of invertebrates. And lizards might be important invertebrate eaters, they might be important predators, but they don't eat vertebrate animals very often. Snakes eat vertebrates far more. Typically in most snakes' diets, it's vertebrates. There are small snakes that specialize on things like slugs or earthworms, but in general, most snakes are eating other vertebrates, and that really puts them at the top of a food chain or a food web or in the ecosystem. The same way you've got something like a bald eagle or a red-tailed hawk or a wolf or whatever kind of thing people think of as being, an important predator. An important predator is often something that eats other vertebrates. And so snakes are really important in ecosystems as part of that top predator food web, food chain aspect. And there's some trickle-down effects that I always like to make people think about, which is imagine, and we'll use the US as our example because people will be most familiar with it, but something we don't like in the US are ticks, particularly deer ticks and Lyme disease and, alpha, where you're allergic to eating meat for a while. People in the US definitely don't like that, right? It's like a country of carnivores. And people,
not too fond of mice, probably.
Yeah,
well,
right?
Yeah.
So there's mice. They're carrying around these deer ticks. They're one of them. The deer mice are the main vector for deer ticks. And mice are carrying other stuff, right? We're probably not going to have plague here, but hantavirus is another mouse vector disease. So when you don't like snakes or you want to actually go out of your way to kill snakes, you're taking away one of the things in the environment that controls things like mice, because a lot of snakes eat rodents. A lot of them are eating deer mice. And although snakes don't need to feed every single day or even every single week, or for some snakes even every month, if something like a bull snake or a gopher snake, a pine snake, which is what's right here, if this snake comes across a whole nest of mice, it'll eat all of them, right? It's happy, it's going to take that opportunity. And so imagine you have snakes like this, they're going out, they are eliminating tons and tons and tons of these vectors for human diseases, things like Lyme disease. And these snakes are doing a good job at it. And they're getting into places that something like an owl or a hawk isn't going to see, right? Because a snake can get into all these little crevices, whereas something like a hawk flying around is looking down, or it's sitting on the power line. It needs to see it moving. Snake's using its tongue and can get in there and take everybody in that nest out. And so that's really helping to keep the ecosystem at least in check. If you get rid of all the snakes, you're definitely going to end up having a cascading effect where now you're going to have a lot more ticks, potentially. So that's a big, big part of it, is I think letting people know, okay, so it's not just this ecosystem that you're not part of. This is something that does trickle down to humans. Another thing that I like to emphasize for more tangible reasons, why should we care about snakes? Why shouldn't we just kill them all, right? So one is human health, human disease, but also human medicine. There are drugs that can be made from snake venom. And so when you think about what snake venom is and what it does, what you're taking is modified saliva that has all sorts of different special properties that have an effect on what that snake eats, so the prey item. And so those effects, whether the venom is neurotoxic and is attacking the nervous system and shutting it down by clogging up all your neurotransmitters, or whether it is hemotoxic or cytotoxic, where it's attacking your cells and your blood vessels are kind of bursting and you're internally hemorrhaging and being digested from the inside out. If you take single components from these venoms, you can do things like make blood pressure drop or block a neurotransmitter so that it's like a painkiller. And you can take snake venom and create drugs that are great for humans to use. There's one that's made from pygmy rattlesnakes, which are very closely related to the Massasaugas that are in Illinois and Indiana and kind of hugging the Great Lakes. But there's a drug that's made and used in hospitals for people who are potentially likely to have a recurrent heart attack after having a heart attack. And that drug comes from snake venom. And so, you know, by killing snakes, but especially venomous snakes, you know, you're possibly ruining our chances for some medical impacts that directly affect humans. And so that's another thing that I always think people should think about, versus just this immediate, I hate snakes because they're evil, which I guess that's what people don't like. Every snake I've ever caught has been going away, maybe staying still, hoping you don't see it, or trying to get the heck out of Dodge, right? They're always trying to take off from you. They've never come to me, and they've certainly never come to me and then they're like, let me take a bite. Like, that's never happened.
So could you talk a little bit about how snakes navigate their environment and find their way?
Snakes, so one of the things that when I tell people why I think snakes are so cool is they are able to do so many things without having legs and fill in pretty much all the same niches that you see other animals fit into. Again, when we're talking about vertebrates or we're comparing them to legged lizards, they do it all without legs, and that's pretty remarkable to me. And so when snakes are moving through their environment, they're doing it without legs. So they're using their body, their scales on their belly are made in a certain way, they're long and flat going across, and it's allowing them to sort of catch on the things in their environment and pull them forward. And there's more to it than that, there's muscles involved, but there's a little bit of a friction element and a little bit of a pushing off as they move. And then when they're navigating, they're using some other senses that we don't have, for me, almost any way to really understand, because we just don't have them. So snakes are always flicking out that forked tongue. And that tongue is forked because it's allowing essentially like a triangulation, right? So that snake flicks its tongue out, and on one side it's picking up odor molecules from the air, and they're stronger on, say, the left than on the right. It knows because the tongue is forked and it's picking up more of them. The tongue goes back into its mouth, and it is sort of transmitted between the tongue into an organ called the Jacobson's organ, and then tells the brain, yes, there is a mouse over there. It is to your left, and the snake can then move and go that way. And as it's flicking, it's just honing in on the signal that it's getting from those odor molecules stronger and stronger and stronger. And so snakes are able to do things like find a nest of mice basically by their sense of smell. Snakes also do use their eyes. Some snakes are very visual predators. Diurnal snakes that kind of just chase things down and are real active predators they're relying very heavily on their eyesight. So they're using their tongue, they're flicking along, but if they see something and they're getting those odor scents on their tongue at the same time, they're honing in with their eyes and chasing things visually as well. They're not, when something starts running away, if they're going to actually pursue it, they're going to be relying on their vision. Another aspect of snakes that I find also very hard to understand as a human is snakes that have pit organs that sense heat. And so the ability to sense heat has evolved across snakes in a convergent manner where it's not from a common ancestor, but it's from multiple independent origins in several families of snakes. So there are pit organs in pythons, there are pit organs in some boas, but not all boas. Tree boas typically have pits, but a lot of the terrestrial boas do not. So tree boas in South America have these pits, but boa constrictor does not, because it really is more terrestrial than arboreal. And then you've got pit vipers themselves, which are probably, you think of immediately. The pit is quite different. Although it does the same thing, it's a single hole, and it is maybe even a little more sophisticated in how it works. But it's doing the same thing as the boas or the pythons, which is it is taking an infrared heat and making essentially a thermal image of whatever it is. Snakes that have pit organs can hunt in total darkness and very easily pinpoint whatever it is they're going to try to eat. So it's for acquiring food. Just like venom is for acquiring food, it's only defensive secondarily.
Yeah. Well, what about aquatic species of snakes?
So aquatic species of snakes have a couple things that the more aquatic they are, the more it sort of jumps out at you. So the absolute most aquatic snakes are going to be sea snakes, the true sea snakes, which are descended from land-dwelling Australian snakes. And all of those snakes are part of the group Elapidae, the family Elapidae, which are cobras and mambas and coral snakes, and basically almost all the snakes in Australia. Australia is a place where most of the snakes are venomous. It's the only place in the world where that is true, where there are multiple species and pretty much your chances of them being venomous is very high at all times.
Are there any theories as to why that is?
I would say that it's because the ancestral snakes that made it into Australia and were really successful were elapids. So elapids originate probably in Africa or possibly in Asia, and then they diversify outwards from there, including going down through Southeast Asia and ending up in Australia. And then whatever ancestral species got there, it just went crazy. So they're all very closely related to each other, more so than they are to a cobra in Africa or a cobra in Asia. They're all the same subgroup within elapids. And that includes the ones that then eventually make it into the sea. They're all part of the same subgroup of elapids there. And those sea snakes, they can't crawl on land because they don't have those nice big flat belly scales. They have been lost. Their scales are the same all the way around their body because they never come out onto land. And if they do get washed up onto a beach, they better hope the wave comes and takes them back because they cannot navigate back into the ocean themselves. They often, I guess always, all of the true sea snakes are also going to have a big flat tail so that they can paddle along, and they all give birth to live young because they don't come onto land to lay eggs, and you can't lay an amniotic egg in the water and have it survive. There are other sea snakes when I say true sea snake, those are all the characteristics of those snakes. There's another group of elapids that also sea kraits. Sea kraits they've got that nice paddle-shaped tail, but they actually do lay eggs and they still can crawl on land. So they come and they lay their eggs in crevices along shores and in like atolls and things like that. So those are not the true sea snakes, but I mean, they are also sea snakes. It's just a bit of semantics there.
But so a sea snake will find its prey primarily visually,
it's
or
still flicking its tongue even
flicking
in the water. Yeah. They're still doing kind of the exact same thing. Sea snakes are also interesting though because a lot of them have specialized their diets very narrowly. And sea snakes, the venom they produce is some of the most toxic drop-for-drop venom of any snakes in the world. But some of these snakes eat things like fish eggs. They don't even need their venom. They've really lost that need for it. And a lot of them, their teeth even sometimes can be reduced because they're not feeding on something that can even fight back.
Yeah.
Venom is really to reduce the handling time of prey item fighting back against the snake. So a lot of snakes, if a venomous snake, so something like a rattlesnake or a cobra, a lot of times what these snakes do is they find what it is they're going to eat, they bite it, they inject the venom, and they let it go, and they, step back. And then the rabbit or whatever it is scurries off real quick because it doesn't die like that. But within a minute or so, it's going to be feeling those effects. It's going to stop moving, it's going to lay down, and it's going to die. And that snake then is going to use its tongue and go and find wherever it is and eat it, now that the threat of being bit in the eye and losing your eyeball from a rat has been eliminated. Oh, we lost, because we haven't been moving in here, the lights are on timers.
So, could you explain the process of shedding and why that's necessary? What purpose it serves?
So snakes and all reptiles actually shed to some degree, or at least non-avian. Although I think the scales, I'm no expert on avian reptiles, so birds or dinosaurs, but at least in non-avian reptiles, they're all doing some form of shedding, which is what allows growth to occur. So snakes, like other reptiles, non-avian reptiles, have indeterminate growth. And that means they never stop growing for their whole life. Once they hit maturity, reproductive maturity, they tend to slow way down. A lot of times female snakes are larger as adults than males because it makes a lot of sense biologically to get really big so that you can have lots of babies or lay lots of eggs, whereas males, if you're making millions of sperm, you don't have to keep on getting bigger to do that, right? There's sort of a plateau and it's like you're good. You can start reproducing, you can stop putting your energy into growth. Yeah. But female snakes put a lot more energy into growth so they can maximize reproductive potential as adults. And so snakes grow really fast when they're little, as they're trying to reach that adult size. They'll eat really frequently and they shed really frequently because the skin on a snake is sort of stuck at that size until the snake sheds, and when the shed comes off, that snake can get a bit bigger. And that is how shedding works in snakes, and also in, I think most lizards are shedding the same. Sometimes lizards, though, unlike snakes, they don't shed in one big piece, right? They shed in pieces as they grow. Whereas a snake is going to shed, if everything is good, it's humid enough, the conditions are right, they're going to reach a point where they've been eating so much that the time has come, you got to get a little bit bigger. There's no place left to expand without your skin literally getting bigger. So the snake is going to stop eating, find a good place to hang out that's safe, because when they shed, they produce a fluid that kind of starts to come between the shed and the new skin that's grown in underneath and the old skin that's sitting on top. And their eyes get kind of cloudy and milky looking, and their vision is reduced. And they're just not at their best. They're not at peak performance. So they tend to kind of be under something or in something, someplace where a predator's not going to get them, because plenty of things eat snakes. Mm-hmm. So once the time has come, and that could be the snake may have stopped eating for 2 weeks, it might be for a month, it depends on how big the snake is, it depends on a lot of different factors. But the snake's going to find something rough that it can kind of rub against and break through the old skin, and then, on the head, and then they just get themselves out and they just crawl right on out. So as they come out, the shed skin turns inside out and comes out behind them. And so usually it should be, ideally, in one big piece. So sometimes when I'm out, I'll find a very fresh shed, and it's like, you got to find the snake, because it's probably right around, if it's still kind of damp.
Yeah. So how often does an adult snake shed their skin?
So it varies by the species, it varies by how much they're eating, and it also varies by what sex the snake is. So, for example, in some snakes, like different species of rattlesnakes, when the female is going to have babies and they give birth to live young, she's pregnant, she's gravid. Gravid's really for eggs, but so we'll say pregnant. She's with child, and she stops eating and she stops shedding, and she just sits around for months doing nothing but growing these babies, which seems crazy that she's not eating any food while she does it, but that's how snakes work. When they've got something else going on, they usually stop eating. And so it could be months and months before that female sheds again, or it could even be in rattlesnakes, sometimes I think only once or twice a year for an adult. A lot of times these snakes, I think, shed when they come out of like a big adult, sheds its skin when it first emerges from its den site after winter. So snakes hibernate in colder places, temperate places like here. They come out, they do one big shed, and then that might be it until next year. And so these snakes, when I say they grow indeterminately, that's true, but that growth as an adult, we might be talking centimeters per year, maybe even less sometimes. Most of that growth is happening during the juvenile stage. And so if that snake is eating really well as a juvenile, it's going to end up as a bigger adult, even if another adult is eating maybe a little bit better as an adult. But it's definitely a little bit like what you put in is what you get out in snakes. So the more they eat, the bigger they're going to get and the more they're going to shed their skin.
What are some life lessons that have come to you through studying snakes?
So life lessons from studying snakes is persistence and being in it to win it are key. Because one thing I will tell you about catching snakes is I know it sounds glamorous and glorious, right? The glory, and pictures, if I give a presentation, it's like pictures of me, pulling snakes out of the bushes and, prize-winning photos here of me holding like a crazy big snake. But that's just like when people look at like the best of themselves on social media. It is not the reality of what it is like to look for snakes. And looking for snakes, I'm not going to say more than any other animal because I'm sure there are rarer, harder things to find. And somebody who's a different kind of ologist will come in and say, no, actually, you don't know what you're talking about. Here's something harder. But snakes are, by their nature, very secretive. They don't need to eat that often, so they can spend a lot of time not moving and sitting in a place you cannot see them. And so when you are out looking for snakes, you can have days and multiple days in a row where you have spent thousands of dollars to travel to someplace and organize a trip, and you've got all these people and you're paying all their hotel or their camping or the food, you're doing all this stuff, and you can have days in a row over and over and over and you see 0 snakes. And I will tell you, it's not good for morale for anybody. But what you can't do is say, yeah, there's nothing here and this is no good and like, let's just go hit the bar. I mean, you could hit the bar because that also might make you feel better, right? Like for a day, right? For like an evening, but you can't be like, well, let's just give up, right? We're done with this. Because what I could say is, you might not find anything if you keep looking, but you definitely aren't going to find anything if you just call it quits and give up. And so this kind of persistence towards this goal is something that I found you don't have to be in many applications of the work I do. It's not always, you don't necessarily have to be the smartest person or even the best at an individual thing, but if you can be persistent and just keep at it even when it feels bad, and use all your grit to grit your way through things and keep your eye on the prize, sometimes you're rewarded. Not always, but sometimes. And a really good example when I think about a time that is like this about snakes is I was a postdoc at the American Museum of Natural History, and this would have been in 2014. We went on a trip to Madagascar. And it was the first time I was on a research trip to Madagascar. And it was a long trip. I think we were there 5 or 6 weeks. We went to lots of different places, and we did really great. We were getting a lot of snakes at some of these sites and getting really rare things that had never been sampled, and that was the goal of the trip. So it's like, oh, it's not just snakes, it's the rarest, most elusive ones that are there. Nobody's ever done this. And we were having really great success. And we went to this site, this place called Ankarana, which is this big national park in sort of northern Madagascar, a little bit to the western side of the island. And this park is known for its Singi massifs, its Singi formations. And Singi is this rock that's very, very, very pointy. The Malagasy word Singi means where you cannot walk barefoot because you would never be able to walk on it. And we were looking for a snake there called Aludina macquarti, which is a little snake and had been collected 2 times ever. But both times were in this cave area in this national park. And it was an 18-mile hike into the park, into the spot. So we all get there. We have people that we're paying to help us carry gear, coming with us to cook. We're going to be camping. And I was very intestinally distressed is probably the best way it's the only way I'm gonna put this. It was not good. It was not a good time to have to hike 18 miles for me. And I was carrying this huge backpack, my big hiking pack. And we had maybe 15 people, and by about halfway through this hike, I was the last person in the line. And somebody who was kind said, "Sarah, I don't know why you are carrying this bag because we have 1 million people with us that we were paying to carry gear. Stop, give me that bag, I'm gonna hook that up for you, and you will probably feel my," and so that helped tremendously. Get to the site. Set up our tents, and then it just started raining, and it rained 23 hours a day for 3 days. It never stopped raining. And we caught nothing. We weren't even catching like the rinkiest, dinkiest little skinks, which usually you're getting in these pitfall traps we put out. We caught nothing. The pitfall traps just flooded. It was terrible. I had some rash on my body. I remember I took my socks off. I was looking at my foot, and it looked like the sock was still on my foot because the rash from being wet was like my sock. And I remember I asked somebody else on the trip, I was like, "Do you think I have a staph infection?" Because it was like from my neck down, just any place my clothes had touched. Nothing ever dried out because it was like 100% humidity in the rain. Yeah. And I remember being there and thinking like, why am I doing this? This sucks. And the food, I don't know why the food we had at that particular site was so unpleasant, but I remember one of the things we ate was, I thought it was pasta with like a cheese. I don't know where we would have gotten like Alfredo sauce from, but we brought the food with us. I want to point out, it's not as though we hired people to cook and they procured the food. The person leading this expedition, who's English, so that says a lot about what kind of food. We were eating, this person gave me this food and I took a big bite and it was spaghetti with sweetened condensed milk. And it was not good. It's not a recommendation. So this was all not my favorite time. Finally, we gave up, right? It was like, well, we have to move on to the next site. We didn't find this snake. And on our way back, we're hiking, and we get back to the front of the park where there are little cabins that you can stay in. I think there was maybe a shower, I don't remember. But it just seemed like, oh, this is gonna be so nice. And some people went to the cabins, but myself and some of the other herpetologists on this trip, there was a path that had just been cut through the park, through the singy, where you actually now could walk because it had been made flat. And so the singy's all around you, but you're walking on a flattened path. And so nobody had ever done any herpetology work there because that was very new. And we're walking along, and all of a sudden on the path there's this snake, and it's in a genus that is one of the most common snakes you see. It's called Madagascar. But this snake was different looking than this typical one you see. It was very attenuate in its body shape. It was a really light gray, pale color, and it just had kind of a different look about it. And we grabbed it, we bagged it, and we brought it back to camp. And it turned out to be a brand new species of snake. So that was really exciting, and it shows, you could have all this terrible luck, but if you I can't tell you how much what I really wanted to do was go back to those little cabins and not be hiking more. Because we had hiked it was 18 miles back, right? It was a long hike. We started real early in the morning, and it was about 6 p.m. when we were finding this snake. Right. But it was great. And the next night after that, we went out down the road to someplace somebody recommended, and we found the other snake we actually had been there to look for. So it was super win-win. Yeah. But of course, what would have been easier both of those nights was take a break. Just take a break because this was hard and it sucked, and I don't want to do it. But so that would be a lesson: is
persistence.
Persistence. Right? Yeah. Persistence and just gritting your way through bad times.
That is a good life lesson.
Right? That's a great life lesson. Persistence is key. Squeaky wheel gets the grease, those kinds of things.
So what's one piece of advice that you could give the listeners or viewers or both?
So advice for students, advice for just people in general when they encounter snakes?
Well, I think we have enough time for both.
For both?
For the general public and for students.
All right. So for the general public is, you don't need to be that afraid of snakes. If you're afraid, if you just leave them alone, I'm sure this is what anybody who studies any kind of animal that people are afraid of say, but if you just leave them alone, they really are not going to approach you. Another piece of advice is just because you see a snake in a lake, it's not a water moccasin, it's not a cottonmouth, which are the same thing. But I can't tell you how many times people who have, a lake house in Michigan or in Wisconsin or, wherever around here, like, oh, the lake is full of cottonmouths. It's like, they don't live here. Like, I promise you they don't. I promise you it is Nerodia sipidon, the common or northern water snake. And if you grab one, I also promise you it will bite you, but you will be fine. Also, if you don't grab one, it will not do, it'll just skedaddle, it'll just swim off. People often want to make every snake out to be such a villain because it sounds so exciting. But really, there's nothing like, there's no cottonmouths in northern. Very southern Illinois, there are cottonmouths actually. So if you want to go down there and cry wolf, you might be crying the truth, right? But when you are going to your lake house in Michigan or Wisconsin and it's full of cottonmouths, I promise you it is not, unless you brought them and put them there yourself.
Yeah.
So not jumping to every snake is bad, every snake is venomous, every snake is going to get you. You should kill every snake you see. Really, just leave them alone. Like, if you just leave them alone, they almost certainly will leave you alone. And if you are worried about it or you're scared or there's a big snake in your garage and you don't like that, you could call somebody who would probably happily come get it. You could call your state's Fish and Wildlife group, whether that's Department of Natural Resources or called Fish and Wild, right? Every state has a slightly different name. You could call somebody at a local museum or a local university and say, I don't know what this is, but I don't like it. But most people who like things like this would jump at the chance just to come see it and get it out of your house for you. So that is one thing I will say is you don't need to be afraid for the general public. For people who think that they want to do a job kind of like what I do, or what people who study birds or people who study fishes or they study butterflies, my advice there is find somebody who has the job you think you want and have a conversation with them about how they got there. Because that is the best way to find out how do you get a job like this. When I was a kid, I always wanted to go outside and catch things and put them in jars and put them in aquariums and have them in the house. And so I've always liked this stuff. But I also came from a time where there was no internet. There was no way, as far as I knew, there was no way to know how you got any kind of job that was not a very standard job that you knew people with. And I didn't know anybody who was a university professor, let alone a herpetologist at a university or at a museum or anything like that. No idea. I took a lot of books out of the local library and the school library, and I just took the same books out over and over because there were like 5, right? There weren't a huge swath of herpetology books in the Scranton Public Library. There were some, and I took the same ones out over and over and over. And I can remember telling my 5th grade teacher I wanted to be a herpetologist when I grew up, but I still could not have ever told you, I don't know how you did it. You know, I don't know. And it wasn't until I was an undergraduate in college where, through good luck on my part, and not through being persistent the way I would be now, but somebody reaching out to me who is a herpetology professor at the University of Massachusetts, which is where I did my undergrad, he reached out to me and said, hey, I hear you're looking for a work study job, and I have a live collection of reptiles and amphibians, and I need somebody a couple times a week to come take care of them. I teach herpetology. He teaches some other classes too. He's retired now. But he is somebody who kind of, because of him, he was like, this is how you do this. I can tell you how you do this. You do not, just because you like animals, you don't need to be a veterinarian, which seems kind of sometimes like, oh, I like animals, right? It seems like the only option. If you can now, with the internet, you could Google up your local university, your local museum, and it doesn't have to be that local, but local enough that your parents will drive you, or you're 16 plus and you know how to drive. You know, when people send me an email, not that I'm saying everybody please email me because you want to hear, but I will respond and I will give you my time to tell you these things. Grab a cup of coffee. I'll even buy the cup of coffee because you're probably a poor student, right? Yeah. And I'll say these are the things you do. You get an undergraduate degree in something like biology or fish and wildlife, you know, or statistics. Let me tell you, math, computer programming, very important across all kinds of science. You find somebody to apply to work with for a master's degree or a PhD who has the kind of job you want to have, because that's what they're going to train you how to do. They won't know how to get you a job. For me, for example, somebody came to me and tells me they want to do snake systematics because they want to do it as a university professor or a curator at a museum or something in that line. I could help somebody and mentor them towards that job. If somebody came to me and said, I want to work for the worldwide wildlife fund and do a conservation job, I would do my best to help somebody, but I don't know how to do that. And so finding a person who has the kind of job you think you want and talking to them, because it's pretty specialized. I might be a herpetologist, but I've said, I don't work on frogs, I don't really work on amphibians. I'm good at going out and catching them, but it's not what I'm going to focus on for my research. I'm not going to advise somebody who wants to do frog systematics, because once you get away from kind of the basics, I'm not going to be helpful. I'm not going to be a great advisor or mentor. Do my best. But if you want to work on snake systematics, and you're like, that's where I come in and I'm good at it. And that is really important, I think, for somebody who wants to go to graduate school because they think this is what they want to do, is finding a person, and it could be the person you do a graduate degree with, or you do some undergraduate research with, or it could be somebody that you just use as sort of a mentor. That is who can tell you how to do these things, and you shouldn't be afraid to reach out to them, because I answer every single email I get, and if for some reason I don't, and the person emails me again, I make sure to answer it, because every now and then something does slip through the cracks. I'm not invaluable.
Sound advice. One last question.
Yep.
We got time.
We got time. We got time for one more.
One more.
Yeah.
What's the last book that you read or are currently reading?
Oh, okay. So I read a ton of fiction of all different types. And the last book I read, I'm almost always in the middle of reading something. I go from one book to another, and I have a lot of favorites that are very popular, things like Stephen King. The last book I read is a book called Erasure, which was made into a movie that I've never seen. But my mom had read it, and she recommended it to me, and I just read that too. And it was really, really, really good. I didn't know what it was going to be about, but my mom and I often like the same books. I'm going to put in the book before that I read that I also thought was great. I think it was called Giver of Stars, and it was about this library that I'd never heard about this, but back in the earlier part of the 19th century, there was, or I guess the 20th century, there was a library that was done on horses for people who were in places that didn't have libraries, and so the federal government sent books to this central library, and then they rode out on horses to all these different folks who were up in the mountains and brought them library books, and it was all women who ran it. I'm not going to make a comment on the difference of how things are right now with respect to things like libraries, but people can imagine. And that book was so good, and I learned so much. It was historical. It was fiction, but it was based on true history, and it was so good. So highly recommend.
Well, like I said, if you're willing, we'll have to do a part 2.
We can do a part 2, so you can ask me more questions.
All right.
This is really fun.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.